Georgia, and there were a number of us in that show. I think 5. Bryce Lankford was actually part of that exhibition, and Dennis helped us install that show, and he then moved into his role with the Dishman and approached Ann and I and asked us to really flesh out the show. So we've worked on it for 4 years, and we're thrilled to have this second installation, and we actually really care about this show traveling, and so we're in hot pursuit of that. And I was sitting at the Bearded, is it the Bearded Goat?
Fainting Goat.
The Fainting Goat with Lawrence Jenkins, who is he Dean of the Art Department?
He's the head of the art department.
He's the head of the art department for UNCG, and I was proposing the idea of this show coming here, and we were talking about Flannery O'Connor and why we ever cared about working on this, and I was telling him what we felt connected to, and why we ever cared about doing it, and one of the things I said is, she's a Southern writer, deeply Southern. Ann and I are both Southern, and our work is really Southern. And he said to me over a gin, I gotta say, I don't think that there is such a thing as the genre of Southern art. And I said, well, buddy, you've met your match, and we can duke it out right here. And he said, no, what would be great if there was panel discussion within the exhibition. And he's not here because he's chicken, and he left town. So, Lawrence, we can do this without you. And so, Bryce Lankford, also an artist and friend, and executive director of the Click Photography Festival, is going to moderate tonight.
Yep.
So you want to take it away?
Sure. I'm not sure. Yeah. I can talk really loud.
Yeah, let's do that.
We're going to go around and introduce ourselves and then come back, because I think we're not going to be able to have this discussion without talking a little bit about what it means just to be Southern. But my goal is going to be to keep bringing it back to the topic, which is there such a thing as Southern art and a genre? But I don't think you can have that discussion a little bit without talking about what it means to be Southern. But to introduce myself, as Lori said, I am the executive director of Click. I teach photography at Duke Center for Documentary Studies. I often describe myself as a Southern child born of Northern parents. My parents are in the back of the room, and my aunt. They're from Pennsylvania. We moved here when I was an infant, and none of us knew what it meant to be Southern. And I think we've all learned over the years, but I know that the main thrust of most of the work I've done my entire career, photographically speaking, has been to examine what it meant to be Southern. And I definitely identify as that now, but I still continue to focus on that in most of my personal work. So that's sort of where I come from in this conversation.
I've lived in North Carolina for 10 years, but prior to that, I've lived my entire life in Southeast Texas in a really tiny town. I always knew I was going to leave Texas. I did not connect to the culture, which I have learned since I've been here 10 years. Texas isn't the South. Texas is just Texas. And I've totally made my peace. I love to go and visit, but I just really thought I didn't relate at all. And then I moved here and started to really understand what Southern culture is. And that I could completely relate to. And also, I didn't know anyone for 1,000 miles when I moved here, and I was completely blown away by the landscape and the culture and the seasons, and that's how I really became an artist. it really started then when I certainly worked in photography, but commercially, and when I came here, I started to really focus on projects that mattered to me and haven't stopped since. And there was something else about and I'm self-taught, which okay, good. Is that enough?
Sure.
Okay, go in, Barry.
I'm from a small town called Noonan, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, but I've lived there since I got married. I've raised my family there, but I am from Atlanta. My parents are both from the South, from Atlanta and Americus, Georgia. My grandparents are from the South. My great-grandparents were from the South. So I grew up in Atlanta, but also spending a lot of time in the Deep South in Americus, and also up in Raven County. We spent the summer in a little cabin up in that now is probably kind of a chic place, but back then it was very rural, just a little cabin, and and also my parents we didn't have a TV, but we had a library, and they didn't drive us all over the place, so I read a lot, and so my whole life I read a lot, and the emphasis was on Southern literature. So I would say that my work is influenced probably more heavily by ideas in literature than it is by art. And if it's influenced by art, it's kind of by things artists have written, like I like what Van Gogh writes about art, and I've read and reread that. So those are the ideas behind the work. And then when I was doing the work, I did study photography in college, but it was went to a small college in Virginia, and it was an environmental studies credit because that's who wanted a darkroom. So it wasn't like they weren't teaching me the composition and the art part of it. It was just go out and shoot. And so I have but I double majored in English and art, and then I have a master's in English literature.
And I am Scott Romine. I'm a professor of English at UNCG and department head there. Lawrence Jenkins was a department head in the College of Arts and Sciences until the art department moved to a different college. And I guess it may be appropriate then that I'm replacing him, because I will add a voice of skepticism to the proposition that there is a default South that we all agree on, that it is an empirical thing that we hold in common as Southerners or not. What I find when I ask the question, what makes the South Southern, is one of two things: a very vague answer or a very specific answer, which will be very different from the next person to whom I ask that question. I think the South means many things to many people, and for that reason I am skeptical of it understood as a distinctive, coherent region of the United States of America. As an identity, I think it is very important. That's why we still talk about the South. We seem to be kind of addicted to the South. The Cambridge historian Michael O'Brien, in a book called The Idea of the American South, pointed out that the South has, at various points in its history, claimed to be founded on a certain institution: the institution of slavery, the institution of Jim Crow, segregation, and the institution of an agricultural-based economy. And as those problems, as those defining institutions have either disappeared or become non-distinctive, then the South has not consented to vanish into nothingness. The South survives. Why does it continue to survive? How does it continue to survive? That's the kind of question I'm interested in, and I'll briefly give you a biographical example of why I may think this way. I grew up outside of Atlanta, very different outside of Atlanta than Noonan, in Gwinnett County, Georgia. Was reading a book when I was about 12 years old about the Battle of Gettysburg. And my affective attachment was I was pulling for the Yankees, right? It was the United States of America. I was an American. Why wouldn't I have pulled for the side that was fighting for my country? And I told my dad, I was reading this book, and he happened to mention in passing that if I had been alive at the time, I probably would have fought for the Confederacy. It was very new to me, the idea that I could identify or would identify with a thing called the South. I grew up in a region designated that way, It never made a claim on me. I mean, I understood when I went to visit my relatives in Alabama that that was the South, as I understood it. I didn't live in the South. I lived outside of Atlanta. That was different. And so this kind of differentiated South, if we answer the question, what makes the South Southern, we're going to end up using that criterion to make some parts of the South more Southern than other parts, Atlanta being less Southern than maybe Noonan, certainly Americus. So that's my general approach, and I know nothing about art, so hopefully I will be able to have.
Yeah, right.
Well, Scott, I think that we all agree that's going to make this conversation way more interesting.
Yeah.
I have a few questions to start off with, but I encourage every single one of you to interrupt us at any point. Just raise your hand. I'll keep an eye out, especially if you have a question based on what any one of them are talking about at the moment. And we'll stop throughout to take your questions. So please, at any point, raise your hands, and we'll get you in this conversation as well. So I want to start out with one quote by Clyde Edgerton, because I think we do have to talk a little bit about the identity of Southern. A quote, again, Clyde Edgerton says, "Because I was born in the South, I'm a Southerner. If I had been born in the North, the West, or the Central Plains, I would be just a human being." So there's this certain identity about that, and I've certainly never heard anyone call themselves deeply Northern, as the way we call people deeply Southern. So there's definitely a sense of identity. But the first question I want to ask is there are a lot of different artistic genres that do identify largely as Southern. Many forms of music, certainly. There's a lot of the craftsmen, artisans. We have a lot of them in the mountains of North Carolina that are identified as such. There's a lot of what we call sort of outsider primitive art that is often identified as the South. But I think one of the most strongly connected genres is Southern literature, of which there's a great pantheon of that. And Anne, I know that not just Flannery O'Connor, but your influences, a lot of your visual artwork comes from that background. So can you speak a little bit about the themes that you recognize in Southern literature that you then use in the work that you also identify as Southern?
I would say that they're similar to the themes of the Romantic movement, which is that you are valuing land over industry. So, and maybe that was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, but still you you really want your own land, or it's a sense of place, and you prize the land. And
The train is causing a lot of...
Is it?
Okay, sorry. That like a value of land as opposed to say.
I know. It's gonna be good.
Yeah.
So land.
So Southern.
As opposed to industry, and the individual as opposed to, society. It's more about who you are, who your lineage is, and who your family, and also owning the mistakes of your family and being ashamed of, some of the things, but being a part of a family. Your name is important. And then the imagination versus reason, and that, and religion would go, I would say religion would go in that mystery of life, and being, more concerned with things that are intangible.
All right. So along those same lines, there was I'm going to paraphrase this, but one of my favorite Southern writers is Walker Percy. And he wrote a lot of essays. And in one of them, he compared the values of, as he saw it, as the North versus the South, about the prior. I think it's a little bit about that too. So the way he sort of separated the two was sort of the preoccupations of the North, which he listed as technology, industry, social propaganda, objective scholarship, the abstract, and the ideological, as opposed to the South, which he said was more about the concrete, the historical, the particular, and the immediate. Scott, do you think those themes are lasting themes that identify, or are they getting
These
diluted?
lists have been going on since Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
In the South, they are rash and impetuous. In the North, they are intellectual. How many people in here have an iPhone on them? Or a smartphone? How many of you consider yourself Southerners? No, you can't. Now, technology is Northern. You just heard it.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
In what sense is it a distinctively Southern, if being distinctively Southern means an antipathy toward technology, as Walker Percy, I think, fairly put it, and that's a Northern thing.
Yeah.
Why do we have iPhones? Attachments to the land. Would a farmer in Iowa say, I am not attached to the land because this is north of the Mason-Dixon line? I think that is another claim made by Southerners to ground a Southern identity that is not in any meaningful way distinctive to the South. And so I'm always asking, if these things are not strictly empirical observations, why do Southerners continue to make them? What's important in claiming this identity as differentiated from another kind of identity that I'm not part of? What's the us-them dialectic or opposition that is being supported?
One comment just that I would bring back to that in terms of, I'll get into this question a little later, but I would say that the New South, which we're in, the new South, a lot of artists don't want to identify as Southern. And the focus of their work is technology, it's conceptual, they're adopting those old Northern identified traits, and they don't want to. Being labeled as a Southern artist is a handicap.
Right.
So there's a whole, bunch of work being produced in the South that, so you don't have to, being Southern doesn't mean you make Southern art. Only if, and be making work about the South doesn't mean it's Southern art. It's a narrower and narrower sliver as the South becomes homogenized. So I think a lot of it's less so. Any thoughts on that?
well, and also, being Southern doesn't mean that I reject what in technology or the values of the North, but they are not what drive me in my art, I can tell you that, and it's not how I define myself. It doesn't mean I reject those things. I embrace those things. I'm recording this right now on my iPhone on the table. But that has nothing to do with my art, really.
Another one of the things they talk about is sort of, they value, again, the North values this objective scholarship, and yet so many artists and so many mediums are completely self-taught. Musicians, craftsmen. I would say Lori defines herself as a self-taught artist. How does that influence your work, and have you got any sort of blowback from the larger world at large by being a self-taught artist?
Well, I worried a lot about that early on when I was really first putting the work out there. I felt intimidated about the fact that I was self-taught, and I've learned over time, and this has been very helpful for me, is that we're all ultimately self-taught, because you can be educated forever and still you've got to find your voice as an artist and figure out what that is, and you're going to have to do that really by yourself. So there was comfort in that. I would say, I pushed really hard from jump to get my work out there, and it has not been necessarily comfortable out the world for me to define myself as a Southern artist making Southern art. As soon as I use that term, I've had more than one occasion long before Lawrence Jenkins where someone says, what does that even mean? That's not a thing. And I would say it's a thing because it is to me, and I define what my art is about, and what it is all about whatever the project is, whatever the exhibition is, whatever the image is, it's about me. All the work's about me, and it's always going to be. And I know that is honest work. And if I'm taking the temperature of the room and someone's got a problem with the fact that I'm romantic and that I am nostalgic and that I am Southern, if they've got a problem with that and I adjust my sales to allow for that or what's on trend, then I'm not making honest work. And I'm not going to do that, so I can't do that. So I say it's Southern art because I say it's Southern art.
Okay. But does that presuppose a choice to be a Southern artist or not? I mean, you were suggesting,
Yeah.
Bryce, that many people from the South who are artists choose not to be Southern.
Right.
Is that possible?
I think it is.
I think it depends on the work that you're making.
Okay.
We live in an area dense with great academic institutions, and we pride ourselves on scholarship too, even though that's what they identify as a northern trait. So we pride ourselves on scholarship and intellectual values, and always have. It's often the North who hears our accents and whatever, and sees the primitive work, and they sort of disparage the Southern artist or the Southern writer, or anybody else is sort of slightly ignorant and naive, and yet, obviously that's always been a trait of ours. It's just not something that people tend to identify with.
So if we agree that an artist born in the South can choose to be a Southern artist, for whom the South, their idea of the South, their belonging to the South is a crucial defining component of their
I think
art.
you have to adopt it.
Okay, but they could also choose, then Southernness as a determinant of art is not a matter of birth. Okay? It's not what Clyde Edgerton says it is. It's not just being born here. And this is William Faulkner's answer, right? You're never going to understand the South, Shreve McCannon, my Canadian roommate, to whom I'm telling you the story of Thomas Sutpen. You're a Canadian. You'd have to be born there. If we are saying then that being born there is not a definitive, determinative condition of becoming a Southerner or a Southern artist,
Right.
then it means something different to us today than it did to William Faulkner.
Sure. I'm an example of that. I wasn't born here either, but I'd certainly identify as that now. Yes.
I was just going to say that, as a Southern artist, whatever, that we all, as a Southern artist, how many are there in here and how many have had different experiences growing up? My, experiences in Atlanta within a very, my lexicon is of, the Kings and the Abernathys and of it's not of slavery. It's of this fighting, powerful, the Jews, the blacks coming together and speaking out and being strong. But that's only my experience as a Southern, and that has absolutely, my experience has informed my work as all of our experiences, whether it's typical Southern, I'm not sure about that. Well, yes, obviously it is. But I also think that just the geography of the Deep South alone cannot help. I mean, whether, let's just put history, here. And then just the geography alone, I live in Savannah now, which is completely different than my upbringing in Atlanta. And just the heat and the humidity and the almost the suffocating nature of the environment is a deeply Southern thing. So it absolutely, where you are and who you are is informed by where you grew up, whether you were birthed there, whether you have lineage there. Because I'm only second generation American, but it informs who you are, and if you make work from that authentic place, it informs your art.
Well, so what I hear you saying is responding to like a geographic place, and I think I'm not directing this at you.
Okay.
But you're talking about what I feel like is a unified South, right? And I think what maybe you're touching on, or what you're all touching on, is a manifold South, right? Because the South of New Orleans is very different than the South of maybe
Yeah.
closer to Savannah, but is very different than the south of North Carolina, which is not considered the deep south, or the south of Florida, which is by no means the
Florida's
south.
not the
At least not the south. So, you have the raw material of the diverse south that you pull from. What I'm curious about, and I guess I want you to expand on very specifically, and I would like Lori's input as well, is the idea of Southern artists working in contrast, or maybe even like from a point of rebellion.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
because what we have is, Lori's recording this on her iPhone, but she also makes work using traditional methods, right? And that is a strong point of contrast. Or I think about, Charles Wright writes poems about the landscape, which is a pretty like traditional thing, but does it pulling from a wide range of contemporary and not so contemporary writers and artists and everything. He pulls a universe into a very narrow line of thinking. And so I guess I'm curious about your idea, your understanding of contradiction in the South. Sorry, that was a big one.
Well, there's a contradiction.
Well, I mean, maybe I'll shorten that a little bit. And that, Sally Mann is considered to be one of the greatest living photographers and identifies as Southern herself. And she talks about the importance of a sense of place. I know that's important to both of you guys' work
Very much.
and how that manifests itself. Now, before you answer, every place on the planet has a landscape and a place. Group F64 in California, Ansel Adams and Weston, they shot their landscape. But the way I see how they approached it is very different than how maybe because the landscape is different. But how does that factor, Ann, into sort of, how you make your work and the environment that you're familiar with?
I mean, I think that it is unique to how you grew up, and you can grow up in the South and choose to, anywhere you could grow up and choose to reject it. Or you can, to me, it's not so much, it's using the ideas, and the ideas in literature might not be, it's older literature, maybe they're not relevant like today, but I think that both of our work is a little more nostalgic in that it is more of the old school, and we're using old equipment and a pictorial style, a style from the early 20th century. And maybe, but I don't know, for me, it's, I'm like Lori, this is what's true to me. And the authors I admire and the photographers I admire, but I think that one thing is the South can be a little bit like another place. And it's a little more like Europe to me from traveling to Europe than the North is. And I, maybe that's just because of they have some of the same values. And I think then it could depend on, you could be raised in a family that didn't have those, but that's just like, I was constantly drilled about, I know who all the people, like in my family were and stuff.
And then I want to quickly say, I think, if I'm speaking to what we're talking about right this second, which is a sense of place. I've had a house full of artists for about a month coming and going, and it's been amazing. But we were just talking about this last night or this morning. I make most of my images that I've ever cared about happen in my backyard or the woods that are 5 minutes from my house. I'm not a traveling photographer until we started making a lot of this work on a barrier island off the coast of Georgia, which also started to feel like home. But, Keith Carter, also one of the great living photographers, Southern, now travels all over the world. And the photographs he makes, in Spain or Italy look very much like the photographs that he makes in his backyard. He says, I take my place with me everywhere I go. And I think that's a Southern idea. But I want Scott to speak to that too.
Okay, so if we're thinking of sense of place, a landscape, and we're calling that a Southern trait, we would have to take into account that it's not just that's not the only ecosystem, it's not the only environment, it's not the only weather pattern. We would have to take into account Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee, the Piedmont area of North Carolina, different landscapes, different environments, different trees growing, different weather patterns. Those senses of place, if we understand them to be local in nature and important to us as persons, if they're different, if you grant my premise there, what use is it to think of them collectively as collated under the term the South? Why can't we envision a similar relationship to place occurring in, say, northern Kentucky? Is that part of the South? Do we know where the South is exactly? No, we don't. How about New York? Could maybe somebody have a similar sense of a local environment that's important to them there? What makes the South a useful concept through which to filter sense of place? That's the question.
Can I respond? Did I interrupt you? No, I don't think it, for me, it's not about the landscape.
Okay.
Not what I'm drawn to, or that's not what's important to me necessarily. It's about the sense of home. That's the thing, which I think is a deeply Southern idea that is, I think that's the difference. Does that make sense at all?
Sure,
Does it not?
I don't,
To you?
I would say that a sense of home is not a distinctively Southern thing, that it exists outside the South.
There's two questions back there. Let's start with you in the front here.
I just wanted to ask a question regarding, so it seems like we're talking about the South in the different imaginaries of what the South is to each person.
Right.
But I wonder how does the history of the South, since the South was a place that, slavery was pretty much bolstering the economy, how does the history of the South kind of factor into your event to what you think of as the South today?
I know you guys can speak about this. Is it Walker Percy or Flannery, you both spoke about we're the ones who lost the fall from grace and how that informs the South. We're generations removed.
Walker Percy, why is the South different? Because we lost the war.
Because we lost the war.
And Sally Mann has also talked about that, and that may be how we're similar to Europe, because they're all conquered countries, and we're a conquered country, and it's like the paradise lost, the only paradise is the lost paradise, or And I know that for me, having this family in Americas and from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, that they had this sense. But it doesn't translate to me. I'm not the generation that can worry, that I lived that, and I think that, except that it showed up a lot in literature as being kind of it wasn't. It was more like the women that were left alone, and what happened afterwards, and how people kind of got their farms. My great-grandfather had a watermelon farm and he lost it. How they just kind of scrambled, and everything was so poor after the. But it does. I think that sense of nostalgia is a characteristic to me when I look at photography, of Southern photography. That sense of nostalgia, and it's important to me, even though I don't use it that way. I use it more as a sense of sadness in the loss of the green space and what we're doing to the planet and to the animals. That's how I think. Like my pictures of primate, there's a sense of nostalgia, but I want people to be sad and think, well, what are we doing to their habitats?
I know there was a question in the back, but before we get to that one, there's a quote. We'll get to you in 1 second. Which one? You want to read a quote?
Yeah, just very
We'll get to you in 1
quickly.
second, I promise.
Just speaking about, and by the way, all of this started with Flannery O'Connor's Mystery of Manners, which is her prose publication, where she speaks about the craft of writing. But this is one of my favorites, and it says, when Walker Percy won the National Book Award, the newsman asked him why there were so many good Southern writers, and he said, because we lost the war. He didn't mean by that simply that a lost war makes good subject matter. What he was saying was that we have had our fall. We have gone into the modern world with an inburnt knowledge of human limitations and with a sense of mystery which could not have developed in our first state of innocence. as it has not sufficiently developed in the rest of our country.
So is the Confederate States of America a state of innocence?
Was it, or
Was it?
not then, before they
I mean,
lost?
this is the common narrative, right? We lost the war. We suffered trauma unlike the rest of America. Who's left out of that? Slaves in the South did not lose the Civil War. They
no.
won the Civil War. How does that identity then, based on loss, being vanquished, translate to Southern identities that African Americans claim at rates similar to whites at this current time? That incidentally, African Americans in the South, when asked, do you consider yourself a Southerner, tended not to answer that question positively until about the 1960s. And about that time, they started to answer that yes, such that there are 75% of African Americans living in the South, according to the latest polling, say, yes, I'm a Southerner. I think 76% of whites answer the question positively. So again, if fall is what is organizing our narrative, our history of the South, then there are certain assumptions built into that that I think do not apply to everyone who claims a Southern identity.
Finally, yes, yes, sorry.
Stand up. So I was born in Chicago. I lived in the Northeast and Southern California. And now I'm in the South, and I've been here for almost 20 years, which is surprising to me. Anyway, there are things like lose your mama up in New England. The notion of who your family was can be very important. To people who lived and bred in New England for years, centuries, generations. Southern California is a much newer culture. It doesn't go back that far in time. But for me, being in the South, I think there's like a lineage of culture here that doesn't exist in other parts of the country. And I think it has to do with literature, music, with food. There is a Southern food that is more identifiable than food in other parts of the country. I'm talking, avocados in California. So it just seems to me that there is like a lineage of culture here that persists. Amen.
May I, I'm gonna transpose that into a question if I can try.
That'd be good. She did with that.
Both Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy, in different ways, said things where they were concerned about the decline of the Old South and the homogenization of the New South with new blood without that lineage moving in, and what that meant for the future. And yet South is now, it's a brand. It's Popeye's fried chicken, it's all that kind of stuff. And I do think this is one of the things they mentioned that you were talking about, is nowadays what is authentic and what is cliche about how not just us, but the rest of the world sees the South.
Wait, and not just sees the South, can I interject?
Yeah.
But what is, I think there's a whole thing going on where, especially in curation, where Southern art is mostly being shown as a cliche, and I get really angry and kind of disgusted by that, because what's contemporary often in curating Southern art right now, I think actually is the cliche. The cliche is not the guts of what I see as Southern art. Now, I've got a pretty, maybe I'm not open-minded, but that makes me really angry. I do think that there's a lot of Southern art, particularly in photography right now, being shown, being seen, being talked about, and I think to a great degree it just misses the boat. I think I just fired up a whole nother conversation, which I did not mean to do, but.
Can I just follow up briefly on that? One of the things that's
Yeah.
fascinating to me about how this exhibit is put together is how scrupulously, and Lori pointed this out to me, it rejects the kind of convention of Southern photography associated with documentary. The South has been, many Southerners believe, subjected to photography in the Civil War, especially in the Great Depression.
Walker Evans.
In the Civil Rights Movement, images of what the South looks like in these crucial moments in history have tended to consolidate an idea of the South. There's a lot of what's, I think, called poverty porn now, pictures of very rundown, rural, often Appalachian villages that will run in the New York Times. So the way the South is represented in photography historically is a very selective image. There's a demand for a certain kind of image that I find this exhibit almost doesn't even pay attention to.
No.
There's a pre-visualized idea of the South that people go out and make to
Right.
fit their own ideals, not really necessarily representing everything.
Right.
And do you have any thoughts on that?
Not just that I agree with that.
I mean, I don't want to disparage friends of ours, but the National Museum just had a show that's going to be traveling, and I'm sure it's going to be very popular, called Southern Accents.
Well, it's had a ton of attention.
Ton of attention, and I would say, in my mind, and probably yours and others, there's a lot of hits, but there's a lot of misses. It's called Southern Accents. It's about this new vision of, I guess, Southern art, to my understanding, and yet in this show is an image by Andy Warhol, who I don't think anyone would consider to be a Southern artist, but he's in the show because he sampled somebody else's documentary photograph of some civil rights unrest. And I'm like, how in the world is this in a show about Southern art? It's a picture of something that happened in the South, but in my mind, there's absolutely no connection whatsoever. So how is that in that show? And that happens a lot, not just them. I don't want to
And
single
I
them
thought
out,
there
but-
were, I actually did not like that show. And I thought that it was just, the great majority were cliches. And what is the trend and not, and it was vapid of what else happens in Southern art.
Yeah. Is it okay if I sort of change the subject slightly to one other thing we maybe haven't touched on? And now I realize I have to preface everything with you sitting here. So that's okay, it's good. I mean, there's religion all over the world.
Yeah.
It's everywhere, obviously, and all kinds of religions. But the South has been also deemed as a place that's called Christ haunted. And I'm going to, my question ultimately was how does religion or just even spirituality figure into the work of Southern artists? But I'm going to start with a brief passage from my favorite author, Walker Percy. He's writing about North Carolina in this, by the way. He passed the following churches, some on the left, some on the right. The Christian Church, Church of Christ, Church of God in Christ, Church of Christ in God, Assembly of God, Bethel Baptist Church, Independent Presbyterian Church, United Methodist Church, and Immaculate Heart of Mary Roman Catholic Church. Two signs pointing down the hollow read African Methodist Episcopal Church, 4 blocks. Starlight Baptist Church, 8 blocks. One sign pointing up to the Pine Grove on the ridge read St. John of the Woods Episcopal Church, 6 blocks. He lived in the most Christian nation in the world, the USA, the most Christian part of that nation, the South, in the most Christian state in the South, North Carolina, in the most Christian town in North Carolina. Again, there's religion all over the planet. But how much does religion, I'm going to stretch that out a little bit to say just the spirituality connection, do you feel influences your work, other work that you identify as?
Do you mind, just because I know?
Yeah.
And if you will, I think when you speak about intrusions of grace, I think you speak to that very well. Will you? Like how Flannery O'Connor, what we were trying to even do with this. I think that's relevant.
Yeah, well, the way she meant it wasn't a very specifically Catholic meaning of grace, you know, and I think she said in every short story I try to have an intrusion of grace. There's a moment when the character can reject grace, and one of the things she's writing about is she's Catholic, which is not the typically Southern thing. And I'm Episcopal, and not in Atlanta, because I live down the street from church, but in Noonan, it sounds like that. There's churches everywhere in every little building, and the Episcopal church and the Catholic church are out of town, and they go, oh, go there. It's just, you know, as hard as Atlanta's trying to make Noonan a suburb, it's still a little like, you know, oh no, if you have to go to these big churches downtown. But it was, I think you can also take it to mean, you know, it's a myth, because as much as she talked about mystery and spirituality, you can broaden or I think you can broaden your definition of God to be, and grace, but, you know, to be more of a, the power coming from nature. You don't really have to call it, you know, even though that's maybe what I would call it, but it's also,
When you
I'm
speak
trying to
about,
mainstream that
no,
question.
but we speak about too about just the separation between, you know, how man's become separated from sort of the, I think
Well,
that's
yeah, so for
similar.
me, and that's, a lot of my ideas come from T.S. Eliot, and it's like the Grail quest or the myth, and the, you know, man has become, the world is broken, the modern world is broken, and people don't have anything to believe in, and we need the you know, it's a cycle, but we need someone to come along and save us. And people are, and I see this from when I was teaching high school, is people, you know, you have gangs, or they don't have something important to believe in. They might believe in, they're so materialistic, and they don't, you know, but it's, so it's, you know, for T.S. Eliot, the answer was religion. For Flannery O'Connor, it is, but it's definitely, there needs to be something higher than what you experience on the material world, and it could be through nature, you know. And I see it that I can put nature in there, and that when you go to a wilderness place, you can't help but experience, you know, nature or God. And when you like sit and stare at a monkey for, you know, that's looking at you, you can't help but know that we're part, you know, that we're similar. And we've lost touch with that too. Man's, you know, in the city has lost, and maybe it's a little bit of a rural city thing that I'm looking at a southern northern thing, but it is, I think it is a southern
But I think that
preoccupation.
speaks to religion.
Yeah.
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 Well, it's all around. You
Yeah.
can't get away from it in the South.
I do think there's a rural-urban split here. I don't know that Greensboro, per se, or as an example of a moderately sized southern city, would be very different from a similar city in Ohio or New York in terms of its religious practices. I do think in southern towns, the church, usually a Protestant church of some kind, oftentimes many different kinds, as Walker Percy points out, plays a social function that may not be the same function as in Idaho or Ohio. That's one area in which I do believe if we looked at the South, tried to map it empirically and inductively, we would find a distinctive pattern. Where does that religion, where does the function of religion come from? Most of the mainline Protestant churches in the U.S. split over the issue of slavery in the 1840s and the 1850s. So we now have the United Methodist Church. That's because in 1844, the Methodist Church split, and in 1969 it reunited. 1969, after the Civil Rights Movement, finally reunited. And so I think this is not a scholarly claim, it's a hypothesis, that Southern religion tends to develop in a kind of Calvinist, deterministic line. There's an order to the universe that we are asked by God to accept, and that particular valence of religion does some of the work that a slave regime did after slavery is abolished. That the church specifically is a kind of covert way of operating a racial hierarchy. Again, I'm not sure that's true. I would not write on this subject and try to publish it, but that's a hypothesis I throw out. I don't know that it has continued in that vein. I think many people in the South practice religion without any covert racial animus or function even. But I think historically, if you look at the late 19th century, was the period I'm thinking about most specifically, you do see churches working that way.
And so
White churches.
I have a question,
Yeah.
which would be, do you think, as a region, that religion informs Southern art more so than other regions in America?
I would have to answer in terms of literature, not being able to really have a big enough sample to talk about art, visual art per se. Yeah, I mean, I find maybe 20,
Oh, look, we broke him right there.
20% higher religious sensibility in Southern art than in non-Southern art. Yeah, I still see some residue there that would allow us to identify something in the shape of the South.
Well, if I may jump in here too, so my parents grew up in Pennsylvania, so there's Quakers all over there, and you always see the symbols on the barns, and there's craftsmanship and that stuff certainly everywhere. But I think tying religion together with the, again, naive primitive art here, one of the things I was reading recently was how a lot of artists in the South are people who were traditionally, they worked and they would never, to think of themselves as artistes would be presumptuous, and they'll do these things, which are these miraculous things, because as they will often say themselves, because I can no longer do useful work. But a lot of that comes and manifests in the form of like people like Reverend Howard Finster,
Right.
who, and there's lots more besides him, who it's the spirit that comes down and tells them make sacred art. And, I haven't seen that as much in other regions as I have in the South.
Yeah, I think the outsider art in the South is definitely subject matter, and the fact that it's visionary art probably inspired by religion.
Yep.
Finster, St. E.O.M. and,
Yep.
a lot
When does
of-
outsider art happen?
Where or when?
When?
When does it happen?
Yeah.
When
It
I'm
was an
sleeping-
outsider art in 1890, right?
Right. Yeah.
60s, 70s?
I think because, I think outside art is when it ceased having to be practical art. Like if you're whittling something that's a toy, it's practical, but I think when it started becoming like just for the sheer revelation of it. But I couldn't.
Well, it's
date it.
self-taught.
Self-taught, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my
So
question
do
would
you
be,
mean-
when does a market for outsider art develop? Because
Oh
that's
my
one of
gosh.
the questions
Yeah.
about the South, is to what extent is what we think about the South the result of a demand for a certain kind of South? We've talked about this with art and cliche, and the exhibit you're talking about, Southern accents going around. That dynamic is not new. In the late 19th century, you have an America that's standardizing, bureaucratizing, industrializing, and as most societies undergoing that shift to a modern economy experience, there's a desire for something old, something associated with the folk, something associated with an older, more traditional way of life. And so the literary magazines of the day are full of examples of this in the South. Here's an older, more traditional, more folkish way of life. And I think with any big economic shift of a kind I think you find in the 60s and 70s, or social shift, there is a kind of new urge for representations of the authentic that outsider art potentially is filling. And so that dynamic of what the South actually is, as opposed to how people want it to be for whatever reason, that's a tension that always exists.
And I want to say very quickly before you
Yeah.
get to that question, the pendulum, I think, always swings.
Yeah.
And so, maybe the hottest thing right now is what I think of as being the cliche and but what's on trend. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, like there was a shift where people started to care about that sort of thing. But it does just go, and if you can wait it out as an artist.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
And
Yeah. We're going to try to wrap this up. We really could go all night, I promise you. So there's a couple more burning questions. I know you.
I was just going to make a comment about outsider art, because I'm thinking about Thornton Dial, who's actually, yes, and Thornton Dial is, of course, considered an outsider artist, but a lot of his like pieces, especially like the collage and like multimedia pieces, are really good artists. Like Mark Rauschenberg, not.
Yeah. We'll wait.
Not so much in line with something like folk art, something like that. It feels in no way like folk art in the same way. But then I think about someone like, and I'm making a stretch and I'm following, so I'm curious about what you all think about this. That sort of blend of what feels like folk and then what feels like something deeply,
Yeah.
You're okay.
just trying to, but also like deeply contemporary. So something like thinking about William Faulkner's like As I Lay Dying, which feels like kind of like a really interesting Southern epic that's also super modernist in its, its composition. And so like I guess I wondered about like how you place that.
Like this is the guy who makes the Whirly Gigs. It has the museum that's open in Wilson, North Carolina.
I think it's John Worley.
John.
No, but I think Wallace
There.
Simpson.
Wallace.
Like I that's to me primitive, naive folk art writ large.
And super
And now
contemporary,
really seen as
cool,
very
and-
cool and collectible, and valuable, and somehow authentic.
Yeah.
Right. Any more questions before we wrap up? Yes, Steve.
One's just rhetorical. I wonder if anybody's ever heard a voice from God saying, make Southern art.
Make Southern art not stick
But,
up.
the other thing I was going to say.
No, they didn't hear that.
I knew there was a reason you
Wait,
came.
okay, where he said
I'm going to
this-
say this back. What he said was, this is a rhetorical question. Has anyone ever heard a voice from God saying, make Southern art?
The other thing I was wondering is, especially in this day and age, we're so busy trying to say things are or aren't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I tend to think in terms of continuums. If I'm born and raised in the South, and I'm trying to understand the South, and I'm exploring the similarities and differences between other places, what else would you call me other than a Southern artist? However, if I'm out with a camera or a sketch pad, and I am standing in front of a church building and photographing it, and a next one, and a next one, and I'm just doing this in a sort of matter-of-fact, I won't even call it documentary, but just in a recording fashion, I would not call myself a Southern artist. I would say I'm somebody who is trying to depict what the South looks like, or may look like. And most likely, people fall somewhere in between. And maybe that's a more useful way to think about it rather than
A debate.
yes or no.
No, and I actually never feel an internal debate, but I have been confronted more than once in my 10 years where I've really been focusing out in the world, and that's why I started to actually know I have to be able to respond to that in some way. I was not sitting around thinking about it. I wasn't sitting thinking I'm a Southern artist, never once, until I was confronted about it. So that's when I started to really think about, well, what does that actually mean? Yeah.
So one more question in the back, probably the last one, unless you guys want to make some more last comments.
Yeah,
But
sure.
yes.
Great, so I'll throw a wrench into it right at the end. Two wrenches, actually, one an aphorism and one an observation. I think the aphorism, well, I'll start with the observation. I'm a Western historian. I study Native Americans in California. I'm interested in the fact that we talk a lot about indigeneity, indigenous, but we haven't mentioned in any way the concept of indigeneity in that sense. And there's a lot of similarities that we explore between tribal art, tribal sense of space, tribal sense of place, what constitutes native art, what constitutes indigenous art.
They lost a war too.
Yeah, exactly. And
You
also-
should have been on this panel, dude.
And also, they are not mentioned in our discussions of Southern, in the way that they are mentioned in our discussions of the West. The aphorism is, when I moved out here years ago, a colleague of mine said, as a warning, the North is more honest and polite, and the South is more polite than honest. And it's always stuck with me. There you go.
So that's it. I really like that question. Which is it?
Bless your heart.
Great. Any more, you guys want to wrap,
Yeah,
anything,
no,
any last
you wanna
comments on
speak to
stuff?
I just wanted to say there's some really good work in Native American studies, Native Southern studies, that ask precisely this question. The South before the South. We heard a reference to Gerald O'Hara. It's all about the land is the only thing that lasts. He owns terror because the natives have been displaced. And there's a lot of scholarship asking, if we're thinking about a Southern sense of land ownership, what about people who own the land for whom Southern meant nothing? So it's out there. It's been
Well, where we photograph on Ossabaw Island, it's there's a road there that's one of the oldest continually traveled roads, if not the oldest in the United States. And we, haven't really been talking about that work, but we definitely acknowledge and explore the fact that in fact, my series is called Land of the Yukon Holly, which Ossabaw means, which was named by the Native Americans that lived there. But we definitely think about everybody who's lived there when we're doing this one,
Scott and Lori, thank you very much. Thank you guys. That's it. Thank you guys for coming out. Great questions. Thank you. That was great. I'm so glad you were here to mix it up with. That was fantastic. That was great. Tore it up.
No, we needed it. Otherwise, we would have just been sitting around shooting shit.
Yeah, we wouldn't have had any opposition probably.
Well, I figured Connor, Catholic, and I need a devil's advocate, right?
Oh, we needed. That's why we're so mad when Lawrence bailed. We're like, we're all just gonna, agree.
Previewed this in our telephone call the other day, and I may end up needing Lawrence after all.